Yo, what's good, everyone? So I was actually about to head out this morning, had some errands to run, wasn't even planning to watch Get Up Live, but then my phone starts blowing up with notifications about the 49ers, and I'm seeing words like triple dose of good news and major updates. And I'm thinking, there's no way I can miss this. So I cancel everything, pour myself another cup of coffee, and I sit down to watch what ended up being one of the most informative and honestly encouraging get-up segments about the Niners that I've seen since their season ended in that brutal divisional round loss to Seattle. And let me tell you, after watching that absolute beatdown on Saturday night, where the Seahawks just completely dominated San Francisco in every phase of the game, I needed some good news. We all needed some good news. And the Get Up crew delivered in a major way with injury updates, recovery timelines, and some fascinating coaching carousel developments that could significantly impact how the 49ers offseason plays out. So the show opened with Mike Greenberg setting the stage by acknowledging that yes, the 49ers season ended in devastating fashion. Yes, there are major questions about this roster construction and whether they're too old and too slow to compete with the elite teams in the NFC. But before we get into all the doom and gloom off-season analysis, there's actually some legitimately positive news coming out of San Francisco that should give fans hope heading into 2026. And when Greeny says triple dose of good news, he's not exaggerating. We're talking about 3 separate major updates that all came out on the same day during the 49ers locker room cleanout. The first piece of news, and this is the big one that had the entire Get Up panel buzzing, was about George Kittle's Achilles injury and his recovery timeline. Now, when Kittle went down against the Eagles in the wild card round, everyone watching knew immediately how serious it was. You don't see a player grab the back of their leg like that and have it be anything other than an Achilles tear, and for a tight end who relies so heavily on explosiveness, speed, and power to be effective, an Achilles injury is basically the worst-case scenario short of a career-ending situation. But here's where the good news comes in, and Dan Orlovsky really broke this down beautifully on the show. Kittle had his surgery last week, and apparently everything went as well as it possibly could have gone. The surgeon was extremely happy with how the procedure went, and here's the critical detail that Orlovsky emphasized. Kittle's Achilles tore high up near his soleus muscle, which is actually the best-case scenario when you suffer this type of injury. It was a clean tear, which meant they didn't have to drill into his heel bone, and the location of the tear is in an area with significantly better blood flow, which dramatically improves healing time and recovery. Jeff Darlington was on the panel, and he really put this in perspective by comparing modern Achilles recovery to what it was like even just 5 or 6 years ago. He said that if Kittle had suffered this exact same injury back in like 2020 or 2021, he'd probably be looking at missing the entire 2026 season. The recovery protocols weren't as advanced, the surgical techniques weren't as refined, and guys just took longer to get back to full strength. But with the advances in sports medicine and rehabilitation that we've seen over the past few years, Kittle is actually looking at a timeline where he expects to be back well before November. Let me break down what that means, because the Get Up crew really emphasized how significant this timeline is. Kittle tore his Achilles on January 11th during that Eagles game. He had surgery last week, which means we're looking at mid to late January for the procedure. If he's saying he expects to be back well before November, that's potentially only a 9 or 10-month recovery from the date of injury to when he's back on the field. That would have been absolutely unheard of a decade ago. But now, with guys like Cam Akers and Aaron Rodgers coming back from Achilles tears in under a year, it's becoming more realistic to expect these accelerated timelines. Mina Kimes jumped in here with a really important point about what back actually means in this context. She was emphasizing that there's a difference between being medically cleared to practice and being back to 100% of your previous ability. The concern with Kittle isn't whether he'll be able to play in 2026. It sounds like he definitely will. But whether he'll be the same explosive, dominant player we've seen throughout his career, when he does return. But here's where the optimism comes in. And this is what Dan Orlovsky really hammered home. Before the Achilles injury, Kittle looked absolutely phenomenal in 2025. In only 11 games played, he was targeted 69 times, caught 59 passes for 628 yards, and 7 touchdowns. The Get Up panel pulled up the projected stats if you extrapolate that over a full season, and you're looking at something like 90 catches, 1,000-plus yards, and double-digit touchdown. That's elite tight end production, and Kittle was doing it at 32 years old, showing no signs of decline. The panel discussed how Kittle's game is built on more than just straight-line speed. Yeah, he's an explosive athlete, and he uses that burst to separate and pick up yards after the catch, but he's also an incredibly smart route runner. He has phenomenal hands, his blocking is still elite, and his football IQ allows him to find soft spots in coverage even if he loses half a step from the Achilles injury. Multiple people on the show compared it to Rob Gronkowski's later years, where Gronk wasn't quite as fast or explosive as he was in his prime, but he was still a dominant player because his size, strength, and intelligence allowed him to continue producing at a high level. Greenberg brought up the money situation, which is obviously a concern for the 49ers. Kittle became the highest-paid tight end in NFL history with his contract extension, and now you're looking at a guy who's going to be 33 years old, coming off an Achilles tear, still making top-of-the-market money. Is that a problem? The consensus from the Get Up panel was that you basically have to live with it because Kittle is such a foundational piece of the 49ers offense, and there's no way to move on from that contract without completely destroying your cap situation. But Orlovsky made the point that if Kittle can come back and give you even 80% of what he was before the injury, he's still probably a top 5 tight end in the NFL, and absolutely worth the money. The nightmare scenario would be if the Achilles injury robs him of all his explosiveness and he becomes just a big, slow, tight end who can't separate. But based on the type of tear it was, and the quality of the surgery, that seems unlikely. Then the show pivoted to the second piece of good news, and this one actually surprised me because I hadn't been following Malachi Williams' injury as closely as I probably should have been. Williams is the 49ers' first-round pick from the 2025 draft, the 11th overall selection, and he tore his ACL back on November 2nd on that awful MetLife Stadium turf that seems to claim at least one victim every year. Now, casual fans might look at Williams' stats from his rookie season, 1 sack in limited action, and think he was a bust or didn't contribute much. But the Get Up panel, and particularly Rex Ryan, who joined remotely, absolutely went off about how much Williams impacted that 49ers defense beyond just the sack number. Ryan was using the pitching analogy that I thought was perfect. You can have a pitcher go 5-15 with a sub-3 .0 ERA, and clearly that guy was pitching way better than his record indicates, because his team wasn't scoring runs for him. Same thing with Williams. He only had 1 sack, but his impact on the run defense was absolutely massive. The panel pulled up some analytics that were genuinely shocking. The 49ers' rush defense EPA, expected points added, in weeks 1 through 9 when Williams was healthy, was 6th in the entire NFL. After Williams got hurt, from weeks 10 through 18, they dropped 20 spots from 6th to 26th. That's a catastrophic decline, and it was directly attributable to losing Williams' presence on that defensive line. Orlovsky broke down some film showing how Williams was an elite edge setter in the run game. He's got the size and strength to anchor against offensive tackles, he's disciplined with his gap integrity, and he just consistently makes it difficult for offenses to run the ball to his side of the field. Plus, because of his size and athleticism, the 49ers were occasionally kicking him inside to defensive tackle on passing down, where he could create some interior pressure. That versatility is incredibly valuable, even if it doesn't show up in the stat sheet. The good news with Williams is that he expects to be back for training camp, which means he shouldn't miss any regular season time in 2026. And because he tore his ACL in early November, he's already 3+ months into his recovery by the time we're having this conversation. Modern ACL rehab protocols have guys back playing football within 9 to 12 months pretty consistently, so a training camp return makes total sense for Williams' timeline. But here's where things got really interesting on Get Up. And Mina Kimes made this connection that I thought was brilliant. If Malachi Williams tore his ACL in November and expects to be back for training camp, what does that mean for Nick Bosa? Bosa tore his ACL way back on September 21st, which means he's already 4 months into his recovery, and he has a full extra 2 months of healing compared to Williams. The panel discussed how Bosa's tear was also reportedly a clean ACL tear, which is the best-case scenario for that type of injury. If Williams is confident about being ready for training camp after a November injury, Bosa should absolutely be ready for the start of the 2026 season given his September injury date. That's huge for the 49ers, because losing Bosa for any portion of next season would have been devastating for their pass rush and their overall defensive effectiveness. Darlington brought up that Bosa wasn't at the facility for locker room cleanout day, and apparently he hasn't been around much during his rehab process. But the Get Up crew was very clear that this is not a Brandon Ayuk situation where there's friction or bad blood. Bosa was voted team captain by his teammates, he's universally respected within the organization, and he's just chosen to do his rehab away from the facility, which is pretty common for guys recovering from major injury. The third piece of good news, and this is more procedural but still important, is just the overall health trajectory of the roster heading into the offseason. The panel discussed how the 49ers are basically getting 3 foundational players back from major injuries: Kittle from the Achilles, Malachi Williams from the ACL, and Nick Bosa from the ACL. When you're trying to compete for championships, having that kind of talent returning to health is absolutely crucial. But then Greenberg steered the conversation toward the broader roster construction issues that the 49ers face, and this is where things got more critical and analytical. The consensus on Get Up was that yes, getting Kittle, Williams, and Bosa back healthy is great news, but it doesn't solve the fundamental problems that we saw exposed in that Seahawks game. Kimes really went in on how the 49ers looked old, slow, and completely overmatched against Seattle's young, fast, athletic defense. The Seahawks weren't threatened by anyone on San Francisco's offense outside of Brock Purdy. Deebo Samuel had 3 catches for 24 yards. Jake Tongs is a decent backup tight end, but he can't block, and he's not a legitimate threat to scare elite defenses. Christian McCaffrey got beat up and was largely ineffective before getting hurt. The offensive line was the biggest concern that the Get Up panel kept coming back to. Ryan was saying that the 49ers got absolutely whipped in the trenches by Seattle's defensive front. And that's with Trent Williams theoretically being one of the best left tackles in football. If your offensive line can't create running lanes or give your quarterback time to throw against a team like Seattle, you're going to get destroyed in the playoffs against the truly elite defenses in the NFC. Orlovsky made the point that the 49ers need to get faster and more explosive on offense, and they need to significantly upgrade their offensive line. Those are the 2 biggest priorities heading into the offseason. If they don't address those areas, they're going to keep getting whacked like a snitch in a mob movie. Those were literally Orlovsky's words, and the whole panel started laughing. Then the show transitioned to the coaching carousel discussion, specifically around Robert Saleh and what his potential departure would mean for the 49ers' defensive structure going forward. This segment was fascinating because it touches on so many different storylines across the league. Greenberg set it up by explaining that as they were recording, Robert Saleh was literally in the Tennessee Titans building interviewing for their head coaching job. If he doesn't get an offer from Tennessee, he's flying to Arizona to interview with the Cardinals. So Saleh is very much in demand on the head coaching market, which makes sense given his track record as the 49ers defensive coordinator before his time with the Jets. Jeff Darlington had some inside information about the Titans search, and apparently their finalists are down to Robert Saleh, Matt Nagy, the Chiefs' offensive coordinator, and Jeff Hafley, the Packers' defensive coordinator. But as the show was airing, news broke that Jeff Hafley is actually going to Miami to replace Mike McDaniel as the Dolphins' head coach, which takes him out of the Tennessee conversation entirely. So now you're looking at Saleh versus Nagy for that Titans job, and the Get Up panel was pretty split on whether Tennessee is actually a good landing spot for a head coach. Some people were saying it's a terrible situation. They don't have a quarterback, the roster is a mess, they just fired their coach mid-season, which suggests organizational dysfunction. But others were arguing that it's actually a decent opportunity because Tennessee has over $100 million in cap space. They're moving into a brand new state-of-the-art stadium in Nashville. And you're coaching in the AFC South, which isn't exactly loaded with super teams. Kimes made a really interesting point about Saleh's tenure with the Jets and why we shouldn't judge him too harshly based on that experience. He never had a quarterback in New York. He was forced to try to win games with Zach Wilson at quarterback, and when they finally got Aaron Rodgers, he tore his Achilles 4 plays into the season. It's basically impossible to win in the NFL without competent quarterback play, and Saleh never had that opportunity with the Jets. If Saleh goes to Tennessee and they draft Cam Ward or someone like that, he'd actually have a legitimate quarterback to build around for the first time in his head coaching career. The panel seemed to think that could be a much better situation for him compared to what he dealt with in New York. But here's where things get complicated for the 49ers. If Saleh leaves to take a head coaching job, who replaces him as defensive coordinator? And even more interesting, there's apparently some speculation that Saleh might try to bring Clint Kubiak with him to Tennessee as his offensive coordinator. Kubiak currently works under Kyle Shanahan as the 49ers offensive coordinator, but he doesn't actually call plays. Shanahan handles all the play-calling duties himself. If Kubiak went to Tennessee with Saleh, he'd actually get to call plays for the first time, which would be a significant step up in his career responsibilities and autonomy. The Get Up panel discussed whether the 49ers would block that move or whether they'd let Kubiak go since he's not really calling plays anyway. There wasn't a consensus, but the sense was that San Francisco probably wouldn't stand in the way of a coach advancing his career, especially if it means going from a non-play calling OC role to a play-calling OC role. As for Saleh replacements, Darlington ran through some names that the 49ers might target. The top candidate seems to be Brian Flores, who's currently the defensive coordinator in Minnesota and whose contract is up. Flores has been one of the best defensive minds in football, his Vikings defense has been elite, and he'd be a natural fit in San Francisco's scheme. Jim Schwartz from Cleveland was another name mentioned. He runs the Wide 9 defensive system and has a long track record of success coordinating defenses. Raheem Morris was brought up because of his close relationship with Kyle Shanahan. Apparently, Shanahan has said publicly that if he were a GM, Morris would be the head coach he'd want to hire. Morris just got fired by Atlanta, so he might be available for a DC role. And then there's the internal option of promoting Gus Bradley, who already knows the scheme and has worked under Saleh for years. But the consensus on Get Up was that there are probably better options available than just promoting from within. What really struck me watching this entire segment was how everything is interconnected. The 49ers season ends in disappointing fashion, but they get good news on the injury front with Kittle, Williams, and Bosa all looking at reasonable return timelines. But then you have this potential coaching staff upheaval with Saleh likely leaving and possibly taking Kubiak with him, which creates uncertainty even as the health situation improves. The panel kept coming back to this central question: can the 49ers actually compete for a Super Bowl in 2026? And the answer seems to be maybe, but only if a lot of things break right. They need Kittle to come back healthy and productive from the Achilles. They need their offensive line to be significantly better than it was this year. They need to get faster and more explosive on offense. They need to replace Saleh with a defensive coordinator who can maintain the same level of excellence. They need to stay healthy throughout the season. That's a lot of ifs. And Greenberg made the point that the margin for error is incredibly thin when you're dealing with an aging roster like San Francisco has. This isn't a young team on the upswing. This is a team in the back end of their championship window trying to squeeze out 1 or 2 more runs before the core breaks apart. But the optimism from the Get Up panel, and this is what I took away from the entire segment, is that the 49ers still have the foundational pieces to be elite. Brock Purdy is a legitimate franchise quarterback. They're getting 3 All-Pro level players back from injury. Kyle Shanahan is still one of the best offensive minds in football. The defense, even if Saleh leaves, has enough talent and scheme continuity to remain strong. If they can address the offensive line and add some speed on offense, and if the injury luck finally breaks their way for once, the 49ers could absolutely be right back in the Super Bowl conversation next January. It's not a guarantee by any means, but the triple dose of good news we got from Get Up this morning at least gives us legitimate reason for hope heading into what's going to be a crucial offseason for this franchise.